Welcome to tonight's program. I'm Doug Becky and I'll be the moderator. First off, we've got a number of Normandy veterans with us tonight, and I'd like to recognize them. So if they could stand up, please, and remain standing while I go around. I'll let them introduce themselves and say what unit they were in. So if the Normandy veterans could please stand up. Okay. Main unit.
99th Infantry Battalion. 99 Infantry Battalion. West Carlson.
Jerry Noss, 1st Infantry Division.
James Carroll, 501, Parachute Infantry, 101st Airborne Division.
Ed Swarsky, 2nd Ranger Battalion.
Milton Moots, 29th Infantry Division, the 29th Signal Company with the headquarters.
Yeah, Albert Myerson, B Company 505, Parachute Infantry Regiment.
The most important part.
4 combat jumps.
82nd.
82nd Airborne Division.
Dick Milner, destroyer of U.S. Navy. We were right on the beach on D-Day.
My name is Dr. John Lanier, and I was a medical officer in the amphibious Navy on an LST on D-Day, just off the Omaha beach. LSTs were not allowed to land. I kept a daily diary during this period of time, and I have a book that I wrote, Normandy to Okinawa, and I made 6 trips across the channel. We took care of wounded, and finally they were taking care of them in Normandy. So then we were relieved, and then I ended up over in Okinawa on an ammunition ship in Naha Harbor at the end of the Okinawa invasion. And following that, we were loading up in the Columbia River in August and preparing for the invasion of Japan. We had 900 tons of ammunition on the ship, and they dropped the bomb, and surrender was declared by Japan on the 14th, so that didn't happen. And then we got into the occupation of Japan. Anyway, I wrote this, kept a daily diary, it's verbatim in this book, and I embedded it in a short history of the war. I have a 60-book bibliography, I have photos, I was a ship's photographer, and maps. And anyway, the book will be for sale outside. Thank you. Read that.
Want me to talk nice? Sergeant John Henschel, Headquarters, Company 3rd Battalion, 507th Parachute Infantry, 82nd and 17th Airborne.
Okay, and also Dr. Lanier has his book here. Jerry Nass didn't mention, he's also got his book, and we'll be selling. Oh, we got some people back here. Okay. Okay, so Jerry's book will also be for sale at the end of the program out in the lobby.
My name is Walter Schwendig, and I'm with the 2nd Armored Division.
I'm Merrill Burkstaller. I was part of the 6th Armored Division, and thanks to the good job that these guys did, we could kind of come in late and help finish the job. I was with Patton, 6th Armored.
Our main speaker is Dominique Francois. Dominique lives in Normandy between Sainte-Mère-Église and Cherbourg in a small town. And World War II is a lifelong passion, and I think it comes from the experience of his father and his grandfather in Normandy. And I think, are you going to talk about that experience, or do you want me to, a little bit? Okay, so he'll talk about their experiences in Normandy briefly. But starting with the 50th anniversary of World War II, Dominique has become very, very involved in working with veterans. And I know that I've worked with him in veterans, and he's deeply loved by all the veterans he's worked with, and he's devoted to honoring the service of the American veterans who served in Normandy. And he's written 14 books on various topics, mostly on Normandy. And his latest book, the 14th, is the one that's for sale here tonight. And it's a fantastic book on the Normandy campaign. He's also been involved in films, and the 6th film will be out next spring on PBS, and it's on the campaign battling Grenier, which is of special interest to him, and a special interest to John Hinchliffe over here, who's one of the few men that survived that battle. And I interviewed John for the Historical Society, and he has a harrowing tale to tell, and he's told it here at previous roundtable programs. And Dominic has also been involved in the dedication of various monuments, numerous programs throughout Normandy, and as I said, it's a lifetime passion of honoring American veterans. So I'm sure he's going to do a great job for us tonight. Dominique Francois, thank you.
Dear veterans, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to say that it's a great honor for me to be among you and to be among so many veterans of World War II. I would like to thank, first of all, Don Patton for his invitation tonight. I was happy to be with him and his group in Normandy last May, and to meet many other historians from Minnesota, and we had a good time. And I would like also to thank my friend Doug Becky, who is always ready to assist me in my research when I am at Minneapolis. He's a great historian and a good friend. His knowledge on World War I and World War II is amazing. I used him to start to write the book. Also, thank you to Jim Gerber, who did with his son a great work with these DVDs that we saw tonight, with a picture of Normandy before and now. So, before to present these 4 years of German occupation in Normandy, I would like to read you a little part of my book to introduce my presentation. The man in the donkey cart rode past the artillery battery that the German had built on his land, casting a squall of contempt at the occupying soldiers. For 4 long years, he and his family had been forced to live with their hated presence ever since 1940, when the Germans had requisitioned his land, half of his horses, and even part of his own house. A cavalry officer who had fought at the Somme in World War I. He had now been reduced to watching the enemy construct the immense Crisbeck battery with its imposing cannons pointed towards the sea, just a few hundred meters from his home. Food rationing, curfews, and requisition had transformed him from a free man to a captive. Like many Frenchmen, he kept his mouth shut and waited for the Allied invasion. The Germans were losing on all fronts. Surely freedom was soon to come. As he arrived at the farm, it began to rain. The months of June have started badly, with heavy rain that would delay the harvest. The man found his 3 children in the kitchen of the whole house, along with his niece, whom he had adopted after her parents had died in the Exodus of 1940. The young girl helped around the house, trying her best to perform the chores of his wife, who had died the previous year. After dinner, the man sent the children to bed. He planned on getting up early the next morning to cut hay, providing the weather cooperated. at 10:15 p.m. by the whole Norman clock, the sky. Opening his door, he saw a formation of airplanes in the distance, heading towards the village. As the noise increased, he realized that they were probably coming to bomb the battery so uncomfortably close to his house. He called to the children to hurry downstairs and into the shelter he had built in back of the garden. In the next instant, the first bomb explodes with a thunderous sound, ripping into part of the house and immediately killing the man in the kitchen. The next two bombs knocked down what was left on the walls. Shortly after, two of the children dazed, but only slight injuries, stumbled out of the wreckage. But one of the children and the niece remained trapped in the ruins. Panicked, the two who were able to extricate themselves found refuge in the village as bombs continued to explode in the surrounding countryside. Early in the next morning, the petrified villagers came out of their shelters and discovered that the bomb has partially destroyed their village. Saint Marcouf was in ruins. While the civilians began to sift through the rubble, soldiers with blackened faces appeared, moving cautiously through the street. As the villagers later learned, they were paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division who had landed far outside the drop zones. In the ruins of the house, the two children held by the neighbors found their brothers unconscious but alive. Deeper down in the rubble, they discovered the bodies of their father and cousin crushed onto a ton of debris. That man was my grandfather, Joseph Francois, and one of the children was not other than my father, Fernand Francois. At dawn on June 6, 1944, as the Battle of Normandy began, the Allies who landed on the coast of France began the liberation which my grandfather and many others had so long to see. Like many Frenchmen, my grandfather dreamed of revenge, of washing away the strain of the French defeat in 1940 and of freedom. But he never lived to see that long-awaited day, the day his country was liberated from the Germans. For the Normans, the Battle of Normandy didn't start on June 6, 1944, but in June 1940, when the German army invaded France. But before the landing on D-Day, the French defeat of 1940 had brought about 4 years of occupation, shame, repression, and deprivation. France entered the war devoid of patriotic fervor, at a time when the country was more than ever a victim of political division. Ever since 1918, when France had emerged victorious from World War I, political instability had toppled one government after another, as right and left-wing majorities replaced each other in rapid succession. The country was largely rural with an archaic economic structure. The Popular Front, the coalition of the left, which has offered such hope in 1936, had been stopped in its tracks, only to become a contributor, along with the economic crisis, to the prevailing national malaise. At the beginning of the war, France mobilized 5 million men, but had no means to arm them, while the German Reich was able to arm 12 to 13 million. The confused mixture of pessimism and pacifism that reigned in France caused the country to far no better psychologically than military. Unlike the French, the Germans believed in going on the offensive. Their officers were young, their command structure was perfectly centralized, and their army was very modern, untroubled by the concept of blitzkrieg, literally translated as lightning war. The doctrine maintains that a swift, combined attack by air and land force, the later fortified with tanks, was the surest way to penetrate and decisively defeat the enemy. The Wehrmacht had already demonstrated the concept in Poland, which fell to the Germans in less than a month. In spite of Polish heroism, 200,000 Poles died and 450,000 were taken prisoner. So vanquished, Poland nevertheless continued to show the brave face of resistance, sending its government into exile, while Germany and the Soviet Union divided the war-torn country among themselves. Hitler no longer showed any fear of waging war on two fronts, but France, unable to react, failed to shoulder arms for 8 months after a weak offensive in the South. It was une drôle de guerre, or funny war, to use a famous term. In lieu of a blitzkrieg, the Germans found a sitzkrieg, or sitting war, as they mockingly doubled the French response. Meanwhile, both the French and the English tried to buy time in the belief it first was necessary to remedy their deficit in men and material. Sitting idle for so long, the entire French army wound up demoralized. On May 10, 1940, the Wehrmacht went on the offensive on the Western Front, invading the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg with 145 divisions, including 10 tanks divisions, and 5,000 planes. For their part, the Franco-British allies had only 127th Division with very inferior air support, as the British would engage only a part of the Royal Air Force on the continent. The Allies immediately advanced on Belgium, their left flank. However, the Wehrmacht's main offensive occurred in the Ardennes, completely taking French commanders by surprise. The Maginot Line proved totally useless for its stop at Sedan, and it was here the Germans crossed the Meuse River and entire France. From this point, the blitzkrieg developed with lightning speed. Once they had broken through the front line, the Germans massed their force and surged towards the Atlantic, isolating Franco-British division, which then pulled back into Belgium. On May 19, General Maxime Weygand, who had replaced General Maurice Gamelin as a commander of the French army forces, tried in vain to cut through the thinly stretched German line, but it was too late. The English had already retreated toward ports in Pas-de-Calais. On May 28th, the Belgian army surrounded, and from May 29 to June 4th, 350,000 British and French soldiers were evacuated from Dunkirk under bombardment. The Germans also broke through the front at the Somme and Aisne. After crossing the Seine River near Rouen on June 7th, they entered Paris and declared the French capital an open city on June 14, 1940. In Normandy, and especially in Cherbourg, no one seems to know if they should fight or surrender. For this Admiral Labigot, responsible for the defense of the Cotentin Peninsula, the answer was to stand and fight, but with what? In mid-May 1940, before the recent unfortunate turn of events, an old plan of defense dating from 1905 had had been dug up from the archives. This served as this inspiration for a new plan of defense, which in principle created at best two lines of resistance, one to bar access to the peninsula and the other to stop an enemy attack on Cherbourg. 2,000 French soldiers spread out among a dozen positions from Saint-Côme-du-Mont to Saint-Lô-d'Urville, armed with a few machine guns and antique 75 cannons. With the whips of straw, the French proposed to resist Rommel's 7th Army. The Germans left the town of Aigle on the morning of June 7 and broke through French frontier defense by the end of the afternoon. At 8 p.m. the Germans were spotted at Villedieu. 15 minutes later they arrived in Coutances, where several inhabitants, believing they were English troops, applauded them as they marched past. A little later they had reached Lessay. Toward 10 p.m. the first vehicle crossed La Dupuy and drove down the road toward Barneville. There was not a moment to waste. Hitler has given Rommel the order to take Cherbourg before an armistice could be signed. And yet, at place the waste of straw did hold. At Denville and Saint-Côme-du-Mont, German grenadiers encountered the first engagement and prudently retreat, preferring to wait until the following day to begin a new attack. Cherbourg took full advantage of this precious respite to reassemble retreating French and British soldiers, dockyards and engineers, technicians and submarines. Anyone and anything that could help to wall the British ports. By June 18, the Germans had arrived on the outskirts of Cherbourg. Fighting would still take part at Martinval, Roule, and the fort at Kirkville, as workers sabotaged several submarines under repair at the arsenal, the marine factory on the Cherbourg docks. On the 19th, after having come within a hairbreadth of disaster, a bombardment of the city, and after a last-ditch stand, the Cherbourg garrison surrendered its arm. At 2:30, the end of the hostility was officially declared. The people of Cherbourg, who had fled the city en masse during the preceding days, began to return to their homes. The regional authorities count their dead. 1,000 citizens of the department of La Manche died during the German campaign to take France. Another 4,000 were wounded, and 20,000 who had mobilized to defend the region were taken prisoners. At Cherbourg, as in the rest of Normandy, the occupation had begun. The rest of France was in total collapse. Millions of civilians fleeing along the roads in utter chaos disrupted the movement of the few troops who still were fighting, or at least attempting to make an orderly withdrawal. The government was torn between two opposing lines of thought about whether to continue the war. On the one hand was Paul Reynaud, who had replaced Paul Daladier in March as Prime Minister. Reynaud was supported by Winston Churchill, who himself had just succeeded Neville Chamberlain as the head of the British government, and by General Charles de Gaulle, whom Reynaud had appointed Under-Secretary of Defense. De Gaulle held that France should continue to fight in North Africa, at the time an integral part of France, and could continue its alliance with Great Britain. Opposing Reynaud, General Weygand and Marshal Philippe Pétain, revered as France's greatest hero in World War I, felt that following de Gaulle would necessarily force the French Metropolitan Army to capitulate. This outcome they considered dishonorable, ever so they themselves were imploring the government to ask for an armistice. This was signed on June 22, 1940. During this terrible time, General de Gaulle sounded the clarion call for honor and hope. Speaking by radio from London on June 18, he issued an appeal to the French people. Il faut que la France continue la lutte, rien n'est perdu. France must continue the fight, nothing has been lost. Also, his appeal later became famous. At the time, very few French could have heard it. In 5 weeks, the French suffered 100 intelligence networks, and sometimes there was no communication between them. So, and some movements were communist, and some other networks were Gaullist from General de Gaulle, and they were. The communication was very difficult because they were so opposite, and so that's probably the reason why the French resistance was not well organized. I don't know if I answer well to your question. I would like to apologize for my very bad English.
What about the communist movement in the group, though? I mean, this was a problem also, was it not?
It was a big problem for General de Gaulle, because first of all, the communists in France were with the Germans, because the Germans were allies with the communists at the beginning of the war, and the sign. How do you can explain better than me? The sign, the yeah, yes, and about Poland. And then the communists, after Hitler decided to invade Russia, the French communists decided to fight against the Germans. But they still have a lot of troubles between the two movements, the Gaullist movement, General de Gaulle movement, and the communist movement. And they didn't want it to be together. So it was very difficult. And even after the war, de Gaulle has a lot of trouble to push the communists from the power.
Wasn't the first allegiance of the French Communist Party to Moscow, not to Paris, right? Yeah. I mean, it's true here too.
Yeah.
So, any other questions? Yeah, in the back.
Yes, we know right after the liberation was occurring, where some of the French people really took it out on each other in terms of those who had collaborated, like shaving women's hair and things like that. Well, my question is, how long after the war was it before those types of people reconciled? Or are there a few people who still carry animosity all these decades later?
I don't understand very well the question. You mean how long after the war?
Yeah, how long did it take for some of the people who collaborated to be kind of forgiven and embraced by the French community, and to what extent did animosity linger for decades?
Okay, it took a long time, because after the liberation, the French had a very bad time with because the liberators, the French who were with General de Gaulle, who were communists, wanted to clean France of the collaborators. Even women who had a romance with a German soldier were shaved, and many were tortured and executed. And it was, we say that it was a really bad time, and it took a long time until the 50s. They continued to there was trial about the collaborators, and it was we say a purge of France, and many communists, and most of the communists wanted to purge the country. But General de Gaulle wanted after a few years, he wanted that the peace be coming in France. So he tried to slow down a little bit the purge. But probably Dominique, who was a young kid during that time, can give you some information about that. But it was really a bad time during 2 or 3 years after the liberation of France.
I have a question for you too regarding the communists. Did anyone ever take the French communists to task for their early support of the Germans prior to the German invasion of Russia?
And it was, we say that it was a really bad time, and it took a long time until the 50s. They continued to there was trial about the collaborators, and it was, we say, a purge of France, and many communists, and most of the communists wanted to purge the country. But General de Gaulle wanted, after a few years, he wanted that the peace be coming in France. So he tried to slow down a little bit the purge. But probably Dominique, who was a young kid during that time, can give you some information about that. But it was really a bad time during 2 or 3 years after the liberation of France.
I have a question for you too regarding the communists. Did anyone ever take the French communists to task for their early support of the Germans prior to the German invasion of Russia?
I don't know. Well,
All's forgiven, huh?
yeah.
Okay.
I remember after we liberated St. Lo, some of the civilians were still bitter because they thought the FFI should have warned the people near the coast cities, but they didn't realize that we had to surprise the Germans. We couldn't let, because it would leak out somehow, but do you have any comments on that?
And Doug asked me to tell you something. When the paratroopers, after the landing, several hundred of paratroopers who were prisoners of war were brought to Saint-Lô, where there was a camp, a prisoner camp. And when they go through the streets in Saint-Lô, who had been bombed on D-Day, and many people, civilians, died during this bombing, the French were so unhappy that they didn't treat well the American paratroopers. And I told you that because the liberation in Normandy, and probably the veterans who are here can confirm what I said, that if some Normans were very happy to be liberated, some also were unhappy because many of their relatives and families have been killed in the bombings. And so it's a mix of feeling. Many of them were very happy, and few of them were unhappy because they have lost many of their families.
Yeah, I'd like to point out that in reference to your comment on the communists in the underground or the French resistance, I'd like to point out that the majority of the French resistance were socialists and communists, and the fact of the matter is they were killing Germans, and their contribution was enormous.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And as far as their loyalty to Russia during their Russia and Germany's invasion of Poland,
mm-hmm.
The French communists played no role in that.
Yeah.
I had a class one time at Fort Bragg. It was conducted by an OSS man. He worked with the communists. The communists weren't the largest group in the underground, but they were the best organized and the most disciplined. So I think you're going to have to talk loud.
Yeah.
Dominic, how was your father treated by the American soldiers?
Oh, as I told you, I wanted to read you this little as an introduction about my family background, and if my grandfather and his niece have been killed during this bombing, and you can think that my father and his two brothers were mad about the Allies, but no. And he was later, because some paratroopers who liberated Samarkov helped the neighbors to find the bodies of his father. And it was paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne and the 508s. We have discovered later that the paratroopers, and we have discovered on the pictures that I have, that they were paratroopers of the 508s. And the paratroopers, these young paratroopers, treats the children so well, giving them shrimp gums, chocolates, key ration, food, and they were so nice with them, with these 3 little kids who have lost their parents. And during a month, they became a part of, not with a paratrooper, but there was later an infantry unit who arrived in Samarkov and would stay for a little ride at Samarkov, and they treat the kids like kings. And my father says that even if he had lost his father during the Battle of Normandy, the months of June and July were the best months of his life.
All right, you were a small child when the war started, but when did your war start for you? When did it start for you personally?
For me, the war started when the French soldier came to bomb in the door to tell us, you have to get out of your house, you have to flee, because the Germans are coming. At that time we were in a garrison in Alsace-Lorraine near Maginot Line. And my father was there in the Maginot Line and he was taken prisoner for 5 years. But then the Germans were coming, so we had to flee. So we did flee to Rennes in Brittany, not too far from Normandy. And when we were in Rennes, we stayed at my grandmother's house where we stayed with during the war. And we were disappointed because the war had already started in Brittany. We found out that Rennes was occupied by the Germans. There was a lot of Germans already marching on the street singing, and my grandfather could stand it, the German, because they were singing, and they were so victorious and thought they were superior to the French people. So we had problem with them, and they would mine the bridges, and in front of my grandmother's house they mined the bridge, and the French resistance didn't like that, so they went and take the explosive off, and it was spared. That bridge was spared. We didn't have to lose that bridge.
That was a situation that was at the very end of the war, though, just before the liberation.
That was at the beginning.
At the beginning, they mined the bridges already.
Mining, yeah. I think there was mining and burning, and they were doing something. We didn't have. Well, we had bombing later on. The bombing came a little bit later on.
Do you want to talk about the experience of the bombings in Rennes?
Yeah, when we were in Rennes, I was at school that day. It was the first bombing. I was going to school, and the kids usually after school they will go 2 by 2 and they will go home. But the teacher said to me, "Why don't you stay after school? Because I would like to make a gift for your mother." It was Mother's Day, and my father was in Germany prisoner. They wanted to make something special for my mother. And so I got a prize, and during that time, suddenly we heard a siren, and we knew that was like a bombing coming, and we were supposed to lay down someplace where it was under the desk or something. And that's what we did, and we found out that those kids who had left, before me, home, they were touched by the bomb. They had been bombed. I don't know who bombed them, if it was American or I don't know who they were, the bomber, but we could see a lot of plane with double tail plane, and somebody would say they were Italian plane with two tails, I don't know. But the kids had been killed, some of them had been killed, and I was spared because I was upstairs with the teacher making the gift for my mother. But those kids lost their legs, some of them lost their leg, and some died, and it was a miracle I was upstairs because I could have lost my life too.
And how old were you at that time?
I was about 6 or 7. I must have been 7.
Do you remember any discussions by your mother or other people about what they felt about the bombings?
About the bombing, no, everybody was fearful and we were scared, and but we still were staying in Rennes. We didn't move right away. We would go to the botanical garden, and we would see German, and they were not mean to us sometimes. They wanted us to take some candies. And my mother said, do not touch any candy from the German. Your father's in Germany, we can't collaborate, you can't have any candy. Because we didn't like the German, so we didn't get any candy, and we came home, and that was it.
What other contacts did you as a small child or your mother as an adult have with the German occupation forces?
As a small child, what kind of, what now?
What, for you as a small child, what other contacts did you have with the German occupiers?
One day when I was at my grandmother's house, I was looking through the window, and I saw a French officer passing by, and I was going to tell him, don't stay outside, just because the Germans are picking up everybody, but I didn't dare to say it. And at the same time, a German came very fast, passing by him with a motorcycle, and he had a sidecar, and he took that officer, and he put him in the car and grabbed him and put him right in the car, and the officer said, oh, please don't take me like that, I have to tell my wife. He was just coming back from the store, he had bought his daily newspaper, and his wife didn't know where he was, and he said, I want to tell my wife, and the German said, 999, and we grabbed him, and I guess he was prisoner of war that day with a German. Another time with a German, we had a friend, she was a Jewish, and she had to wear a yellow star. And so we would go with my mother doing some shopping, but she was so afraid to be taken, she would keep that star hidden. She had a red purse, and she was holding it so tight, so no German would see that star. But we found out later on that the German had taken her with her little girl in concentration camp, and she died. So we were outraged really when we came to Rennes, because we see too many things happening. We had ration, the German was eating our food and drinking our wine and using it for fuel sometimes. And we didn't really like them at all, and we didn't like it. And there was so much oppression there that after a few bombings, they were bombing the station too one time. Somebody, I don't know who bombed it, but there was a big bombing the station. And the houses were all down, and they bombed a train full of people, I guess. So that was enough for us French, and we didn't really like the German. We hated them.
Did your mother have any stories, or were you aware of her encounters as an adult with the occupiers?
Did my mother?
Your mother, did she have any problems or issues or situations that she had to deal with under occupation?
Well, my mother had to write to my father, who was in Germany, and then she had to be careful what she write, because we could be punished. And so they would take some cigarettes, and they would write some little word, some special word in the cigarette, and they roll it in the cigarette, and my father would send his mail that way too, so the German would know what we were talking about. With my mother too, we couldn't listen to the radio, BBC, or we couldn't listen to the Ally radio, because they will really stop us, They would really put us in prison even, or sometimes death we could experience. So my mother was always kind, but be careful. I mean, we didn't want to associate with, you know, anything like German. I mean, we were not happy. There was too much oppression in that town of Rennes, Brittany.
And between other children, what did you talk about in relation to the occupation?
With our children,
With other children?
I think we were private. Everybody was kind of private during the war. We were not discussing too much thing because you were to be careful what you talk about. You know, you could be punished for coming against a German. So they were not very friendly. You know, if you would walk down the street, sometimes they will push you from the sidewalk. They want to show that they had priority over you.
Okay. Do you remember when you first heard of the landings in Normandy?
When I experienced the landing in Normandy,
Yeah.
what I remember the Germans, sometimes they were running, they were escaping. They were escaping because they knew that the end for them was coming. So they were coming, because we didn't stay at Rennes because we had so much problem in Rennes with all the bombing. We went to a small village in Guipel, and that's when we heard about the German. They were escaping, running away from the American because they were landing and they were landing. So the German, when we saw the German coming through the village like that, they were racing so fast, and an American plane came down and followed them outside the village and bombed him. He was escaping because D-Day was landing, was approaching. It was started, I guess. Yeah, that was, and then the German too, another time, it was about midnight, we were sleeping in a little house in the village, and suddenly we heard somebody knock at the door, and they were German, who came in, and they said, they wanted to find my father. Where is your father? And they were not speaking French either. We were understanding a few words, and they couldn't find anybody. And so they would say, well, my mother, we want that mother to come along with us to show us. They were looking for something, so we had to deal with that German. And my mother would say, no, she can't go, she just came back from the hospital. And the Germans say, well, who can come with us? But nobody went and followed what they wanted us to do. But they say water, they wanted water, and we didn't like them, so we gave them water, but from the well. We kept our good water for us, and we gave them the water from the well, because we didn't like them. But I don't think they died, but I think they survived it.
As the Americans approached, was there an increase in combat, or was it a situation where the Germans left and the Americans arrived, or was your village damaged?
Our village wasn't damaged because the Germans were just passing by. There was no, like my town in Rennes, where we were before, was damaged a lot. But all around Brittany, you could hear some explosion. You could hear some noise far away, because there was, some town like Fougères and Caen, and that was close to us, and you could hear someplace. We wanted to know more about the American. We were so happy when the American decided to come and stop in Brittany, because we walk about 27 kilometers with my mother and my brothers and sisters to go and see the American in Saint-Aubin of Aubigné. They were prisoner of war. They had prisoner of war right in their car. They were officers German, and they were so proud to show their prayer. And the French people were so glad and so happy to bring food or something to them, and flour, and everybody liked the American. Yeah.
Okay, do you have any other comments you want to make about it?
Yeah.
Don?
I would tell the story about the uncle in the attic.
Oh yeah, when the Germans were searching our house sometime, we were a bit worried because we had somebody on the attic upstairs. It was a grand uncle who had escaped from a camp, a German camp. He was working for the French government. For some reason, he had been taken prisoner, and so when he was in that attic, we had put some hay or something upstairs, and for a few years He was staying in the attic, and he would come down to eat with us when he knew the German they were not around. They would come, if the German were around, he would stay upstairs. But if he knew there was no German, so he'd come and eat with us, and he would go and pick up mushroom with us in the field, in the forest, and come back. Nobody knew he was there. For a few years he was there. And he did for us, he put a bomb shelter for us. He digs outside. He gave us a mask because we didn't know what could happen, after the landing. We didn't know if we were going to be bombed there too. So we had that big fallout shelter that he did for us. And he did that little valley toll, and it was done, and then we didn't have any war. We really were protected in a way. Even though we had ration, we live in a small village, we could have fresh egg there, We had fresh vegetable and everything. And us, for the American, what we would do sometimes, we would sit, the kids, we would sit on the edge of the road, and we would wait for American to pass by, and they would come with their jeep, and they would wink at us and wave, and then we would send them some flower. We would go to the field and make some bouquet of flower with the color of the flag, like blue, white, and red. We will get some poppy, like red poppy, and some daisy, and some bachelor button, blue, and we would make bouquet of flower. And we would send it in their jeep, and they were so busy with send us back some ration, like chocolate ration. And we liked that. And then sometimes we were waiting for them, and we would say, shrimp gum, shrimp gum, shrimp gum. I couldn't say it right, but we were sure that they knew what we say, and then they would send us some shrimp gum. And we will give them some eggs too, some fresh egg and some tomato and vegetable, because they didn't have anything fresh, and they really liked, like that. Yeah.
Okay, any questions for Mr. Taylor? Yeah.
When did her father get back home?
When did your father get back home?
My father came back in July 1945, and I was 12 years old. And when he came back, he was like a stranger to me, because I saw him when he was taken prisoner when I was 6. Then he came back, and he was I don't know who he was, but it was in 1945. Yeah, and another thing we saw too, I was thinking about here, an American truck came to the town of Guipel. I don't know if one of you were there that day, but there were some American soldiers. They stopped in the village downtown, and we went to see them, and it was a big truck, and they had in front of their truck their German prisoners on the bumper. There was about 5 or 6 Germans sitting, and I felt so bad for them in a way. I didn't like German, but they were all shaved, no shoes, they were white, they were shaking like that. And they looked so pale, and the Americans were standing in front with their machine gun in the village, And the Sudanese started to cry because, I saw those German, I said those poor German, I didn't like them, but I still saw them like my father was in prison, and I was thinking they probably have some children too, and prison, they was prisoner. So I started to feel sad for them, and I started to cry. And an American who was in front put his machine gun on the nearby, and he took me in his arm and he kissed me. So I don't know if you were one of them. I always wanted to know who he was. Yeah, but war is sad. I mean, it was sad to see all those people who died, and the French resistance was very, very good. They played a big role in the Normandy. They were preparing a lot of things, and they were doing a lot of good things too behind we didn't know. And they were talked to, maybe Partisan died. I don't know if it was Partisan a year when I was reading that Partisan resistance would die. So every year I think it was. They were tortured, they were put in prison by the German, the Gestapo and all of them. But I survived it. I feel it's a miracle we survived it, because we could have been killed too. And I just want to thank all the vets here because I feel, I went to visit the cemetery in Saint-James Cemetery in Normandy. And it's so beautiful and it's so moving because you see so many little white crosses. And I think in Normandy there are about 9,385 graves there of Americans who lost their life. But it's so beautifully arranged and so beautiful with a little stained glass window and some scripture on the wall. And it's really beautiful, but it made me cry. And I say when I came back, what can I do for my country?
Okay, any other questions? Yeah.
Can you tell us about the city and or your town, how the town was run? We read about the Germans coming in and taking the mayor and killing the mayor and some of the more important people, the leaders in the town, some of the doctors perhaps. Were you old enough to realize what was happening as far as did the Germans run the town while they occupied it, or did the French?
No, in Rennes, you mean in Rennes?
Yes.
Yeah, in Rennes, the Germans were occupying it. They were running it. They took our flag off too. They were taking our flag off, and they put swastikas on the wall. They would hang some swastikas, put them on the wall on big building. Yeah, they were in charge, but the resistance were fighting them. That's how sometimes that bridge who was mined. Some resistance were fighting it. They were fighting them.
I think the question was, did the Germans replace the mayor of the town?
I don't know about that
Yeah,
because that probably was too young. We were not talking about that too much.
Yeah. Dominic, I think, yeah, but I think in general, the Germans didn't put a German into the position of the mayor. They didn't put a German into the position of the police chief, but they made sure that those French politicians or civil servants or whatever were supposed to do what the Germans wanted done.
Yeah, I can maybe give some information about that. In fact, the mayors who have been elected before the war were pushed from the city hall, and Vichy government put some other mayors, and in a lot of village in Normandy, but everywhere in France, there was some new mayors who were very close from the Pétain government. But the German didn't put mayors. That's not the German who changed the mayors, that's the French who changed the mayors.
Yeah, it could be probably. I didn't know what to be on. But Pétain was not loved by everybody. Oh, like this. But Pétain was not loved by everybody. Some thought he was a traitor, But when my father came back from Germany, I asked him, what did you think? And he said, in 50 years from now, he said, he will be a hero. There was no other thing he could have done. That's what my father said. My father was a colonel, French colonel. But I don't know if my father was right, because some people were saying, just the opposite, So,
Louis?
The economy in France must have been totally devastating with the occupation, and your dad then was a prisoner of the Germans, no income. How did your mother feed you guys and clothe you and get money to buy your shoes?
oh yeah, I remember we had to have some coupon ration, and we could buy some shoes. And I know some of our shoes were made of wood; they were wooden shoes. But like the clothing, I think we had ration. You had ration even after 1945. I think I have a little book at home. It was a ration book where you could get but the women had to wait a long time in a queue. You had to queue a long line to get something. Sometimes you didn't get anything on shoes because they were gone or something was gone. I remember my mother in 1945 waiting for some Le Creuset, it's called Le Creuset cookware, and it was something she got because she had a coupon for it.
But how about you had to have money as well
Oh,
as
but
coupons? How did your family get money with your father not there working?
And I wonder if my father was getting some salt No? Well, from Germany, I don't know. I never found. We never talk about money, honey. I forgot to ask them.
That was her mother's problem, Louis.
I know that my grandmother would do the clothing. She would cut everything. She would cook too, and my mother too. They both, they were. And then we had the farm there, and we could get from the farm some egg and some fresh stuff. And the clothes were all done by my grandmother because she had a sewing machine and she could do that. We were blessed because so many people were not able to do that. We were blessed for some reason. We had, we were worried about the war. We were more afraid and scared, to be bombed. But when we were bombed sometime in my hometown, I was so afraid we would go near the river because they told us go to that river and go flat on the ground so you don't get hit by shrapnel. And we would do that, and I was so afraid we lay down. I was more afraid of the mice or something than the bomb.